All right, we're going to go to British Columbia now, where merger talk is swirling around two opposition parties in that province. Business leaders and political organizers are reportedly encouraging the BC Conservative Party and BC United, formerly known as the province's Liberal Party, to figure out a way to work together, and that by uniting the right, they could defeat the NDP government in the next election. But would a merger mean a win? The CBC's Chad Pawson is in Victoria, where all the action is. Chad, I hesitate to ask you what's happening there because it could change before you finish your answer. But what's going on with this?
David, you could see BC United leader Kevin Falcon just walked right past, and he has been the talk of the legislature for the whole week about these vote-splitting merger talks between these two parties. It sort of came out of nowhere that these two parties were asked, are there talks going on around any mergers, considering how the NDP is doing in the polls here? And they said yes. For the past few months, there's been emissaries from both parties talking about common ground. There's a lot of different language being used here. Common ground, vote splitting. And of course, a question follow-up from that is there a possible merger happening? And so both leaders are being very cagey around this, but that talks are happening and that they need to do something perhaps to try and slow down the BC NDP, which is sitting on a pretty good lead in the polls at this point.
Okay, so you can understand the concerns about vote splitting and wanting to beat the NDP, because when you have two parties on the right, in an election coming up. But where did these specific discussions come from? What's the genesis of it all?
It all came up because for the past few months, there's been several polls, with the latest one this week just showing numbers, very surprising numbers, not so much for the government side. They're polling well, 40% popularity vote. It's a bit of a slide, but still very good numbers. But what the surprise is the two-seat Conservative Party, John Rustad and Bruce Manman, who are the BC Conservative Party in the legislature. Neither of them were elected as Conservatives, but Rustad was actually kicked out of the BC United caucus and went to the Conservatives, and they brought Manman over. They're polling very well. They're polling at 34% popularity this week, which is far greater than Kevin Falcon's BC United Party, which is polling at 13%. Now, this is the official opposition. They got 26 seats in the House. They do the majority of the opposition work and are the most seen and most vocal in the House and also out in the community in British Columbia. Yet their numbers are not showing that. They started in February spending $1 million on an ad campaign leading up to the election this fall. They're showing ads with Kevin Falcon at Canucks games, and they just have nothing to show for it. So these these polls are now generating these questions around, well, what about a merger? What about coming together, as you say, to try and bolster the center-right to compete with the NDP? And so we're not really hearing where it's coming from. You can hear, we're hearing that it's like, as you said off the top, that it's lobbyists, it's business. We're not hearing necessarily where politically this is coming from.
Okay, Chad, you've got an election coming in the fall, right? So that's not a lot of time for a merger. And not only are there all these rumors of the parties coming together, there's rumors of Brad West, the mayor of Port Coquitlam, becoming like the new leader of this merged party, something he's denying. Yes. What are Rustad and Falcon, the actual leaders, saying about this?
Yeah, so I think it's important to, what is exactly going on? And we can go to John Rustad here first, where he talks a little bit more about where these rumors are coming from, but what his intentions are in the fall, which is, I think, quite telling.
There's been conversations, in the background for many, many months. And some of them, are by various people, some of them with business communities, some of them, are completely unconnected with either party. But the reality is, as the Conservative Party of British Columbia, we're building a solid team across this province. We're going to be having 93 candidates, and we're going to be challenged with government in October.
So there you hear Rustad saying, well, yeah, there are talks, but you know what? We're going to run 93 candidates. We have this grassroots party that's doing well. They are getting a bump just by having the Conservative name because of the federal opposition doing well. And he wants to see that through with running the candidates. Now, any kind of merger or vote splitting talks with Kevin Falcon, he sees a problem with the candidates themselves from the BC Conservative Party, that they don't have the vetting that the BC United Party, which is far more organized and has far more money. Here is Kevin Falcon addressing that concern about Conservative candidates today.
But at the end of the day, there's also real challenges. There won't be a merger, as I've said before. There's practical reasons why, but there's also many of their candidates are frankly too extreme. I can't merge with a party that has candidates that equate vaccinations with Nazism and apartheid.
So there you hear Kevin Falcon being quite clear about his concerns over all these problems they would have to figure out, and as you say, a very short period of time, 5 months, to have any common ground to try to come together for the NDP. Now today, the one thing I'll mention in closing is Premier David Eby, he held this open caucus meeting where media were invited, and his caucus and staff, they're clapping and cheering, chanting NDP, NDP as they came in. He's doing well in the polls. They passed 25 pieces of legislation in 4 months. He jumped right into this opportunity, this sort of disorganization between United and Conservative, to say we're ready for an election. We've done the work we set out to do at the beginning of this session. And he went out of his way to criticize both Rustad and Falcon over this, what they stand for, and that their votes for their party would not matter as they would for his own.
Clever bit of counter-programming there from the NDP Premier. All right, Chad, thank you so much. This is CBC's Chad Pawson in Victoria. Well, the Power Panel has been listening in on this, the crazy politics in Western Canada today. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson's a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. I want to ask you about what happened there today, Andrew. And here with me, Cameron Ahmad is a former director of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Okay, Shachi, let's start with you, and let's start with what's happening in British Columbia. The merger is on, the merger is off. The mayor of Port Coquitlam is going to be the leader. No, he's not. He's staying put. Everything's changing. Nothing's changing. Explain British Columbia to the rest of Canada, please.
Okay. Well, look, BC has never been shy of wild, wacky, and fast-moving politics. We kind of pride ourselves in that. I've been watching BC politics for the better part of 20 years, although I am loath to say that out loud. But, you know, in terms of what we're seeing, it really just comes down to the same kind of challenges and recalibrations that are sometimes discussed when you have two parties on one side of the political spectrum. So in some ways, that's no different than what we saw around the pains and really the birthing pains of the Unite the Right movement federally. For a while back in the 2010s, there were real challenges between the NDP and the Green parties in British Columbia because they were splitting the left of center vote, and there was a lot of angst as to whether or not the NDP would ever see the opportunity to form government again. You have a couple of different things happening. First of all, branding. So it's not just that Kevin Falcon changed, with his party's consent, changed the name of the BC Liberals, which was often a point of confusion outside of British Columbia. Is it a Liberal party? It was always a right-of-centre party. It was really the successor to the social credit movement in British Columbia going back to the 1980s. But the right-of-centre party changes the name to something that sounds more like a soccer team, BC United. In the meantime, John Rustad, somebody who has never really been a big swinger or a power player in BC politics, becomes the latest in a string of leaders of the BC Conservatives, which is a party that is very much to the right of centre, that sometimes pops up and will start getting double digits in the polls before almost imploding on itself. I saw that happen in 2009 and 13 and 17 and 20. But this time, what's different is the branding of the federal Conservatives. Right. And the fact that you don't have federal Conservative grandees like my good friend James Moore over here, or others who have, as they have come out in the past, and say, you know what, a vote for the BC Conservatives is actually a vote de facto for the NDP. It is BC United / BC Liberals who are the right of centre free enterprise party in British Columbia. Right. That sets it all up. That's why we're seeing all of these machinations and all of this toing and froing and, frankly, panic in the ranks of the BC United party these days, because they're losing traction and they're having their lunch eaten by these nascent upstart BC Conservatives.
So James, you know, there's going to be a lot written about the branding exercise that the former BC Liberal Party went through and how that paid off. But you heard Kevin Falcon there saying the parties couldn't really merge because his party would never work with some of the BC Conservative candidates for their views on vaccines. I mean, what do you make of that? That he says there's some extremist kind of candidates in that party that is now running second in the polls.
Well, fringe voices get pushed to the outer fringe when the party becomes governable and electable, and you have more people flowing into the party. You hope that a merged entity would have the arithmetic of 1 + 1 = 3, that you don't just have the two entities, but you have more people join the party and flow into it because you see an opportunity to form government. David Eby is actually quite vulnerable, in spite of the fact that there's pretty much an ineffectual opposition, almost disappeared media market in Vancouver to push through narratives against the incumbent government. You know, we've been talking on the show, you've been talking on the show about probably the three dominant issues in the country for the past year have been what? Cost of living, carbon tax, and the drug issues, particularly in urban centers. Well, all three of those issues, the ground zero for them across the country, are in British Columbia. So it was only a matter of time until those issues caught up to the politics, and they've caught up. And people have been looking in British Columbia for a credible alternative voice to the incumbent government. And frankly, they didn't find it in BC United. You know, if you're going to rebrand a party from the Liberals to BC United, you have to define what you're united for and what you're united against. And the party hasn't done that in the over a year since they've rebranded and had their new leader in Kevin Falcon. Kevin Falcon is a friend of mine. He's incredibly thoughtful. You know, he has enormous capacity. He would make a great premier for the province of British Columbia, but the party is going nowhere. It just is. And the BC Conservative brand is benefiting from the federal Conservative brand and the fact that John Rustad and the Conservative Party in BC have picked tough issues and they've fearlessly pushed back against the government on some tough issues and provided a genuine alternative opposition in a way that the BC United haven't so far. And I think they've benefited in the polls, not just because Pierre Poilievre has done so well nationally, but also because they've provided credibility. John Rustad, by the way, is a former cabinet minister under both Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark, former Minister of Forests, former Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He knows the issues and he's thoughtful about them and he's pushing back aggressively. So this isn't just about, you know, a brand thing. This is about him and certainly his social media campaign being very effective in presenting a true different voice for voters in BC.
So, Andrew, as a boy from Newfoundland who is in Ottawa, I'm not going to pretend to game out how this will affect the upcoming election in British Columbia, right? But it seems to me if you're David Eby and you've got a few months to go before the campaign, and this is what is happening with your two main competitive parties, this feels like something you're enjoying and may very well try to exploit.
Yeah, I think certainly Eby's in a good position for re-election regardless of what happens. His government has seemed to be fairly moderate, fairly sensible. He's been a pragmatic voice on the national stage and has gotten stuff done, and that will stand them in good stead as they head into an election. Certainly, seeing this kind of turmoil on the opposition side when you're looking across, you can only kind of smile and chuckle and enjoy a bit of levity of just seeing how this comes together. Now, that doesn't mean down the road it's not going to be problematic. But at the current point, it just looks like you've got, when you've got your two right-wing opposition parties pointing fingers at each other, calling one essentially incompetent, the other extreme, and that puts you in a pretty good position to say, look, we're the only party that can actually govern the place. And I think that's kind of where Eby's at, and I suspect he's feeling fairly comfortable about what he's looking at going into. Doesn't mean he's going to sweep the entire province. I don't think there's any, there was some talk about that at one point, but I think that was always pretty unrealistic. But he's in a good position to move forward and run on his record.
Cameron, how do you see this? It's a pretty wild dynamic to have this close to the actual start of the election. Like it's just a few months out, and this frenzy of the last couple of days has been something else.
Well, look, I always used to thought that my home province of Quebec had the most exciting politics in the country, and I guess I'm being proven wrong today. And thankfully we've got our two British Columbian friends on the panel who can break this down for us and give us a window into what's happening behind the scenes. Politically speaking, this isn't good for either opposition party, right? No opposition party this close to an election wants to spend all this time talking about themselves in this way and having us, talk about the intrigue and the drama and the machinations behind the scenes about merger or not. So ultimately, this is just wasted time for them and also not good for their leadership because people are openly talking about replacing them or trying to push them out. So this is not good for them and definitely an opportunity for David Eby to pounce on this. And you saw how he's positioning this politically right now. Using this as an opportunity to position his government as competent, steady, ready to lead, get things done, while the other guys are just busy talking about themselves. So it's just hopefully for them, I'm sure they're thinking, how can we get past this as quickly as possible? And their job as these two right of center or right-wing opposition parties is how do I position myself as the government in waiting? How do I show British Columbians that I'm actually ready to lead? And if you're spending all your time talking about backroom insider baseball, you're totally missing the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, so Shachi, on that point, right, you want to be seen as the premier in waiting if you're Mr. Rustad or Mr. Falcon, but sort of the conversation this week shifted to who's going to be the leader of the merger in waiting, you know, and that seems like an unhelpful narrative to be taking root this close to the vote.
Yeah, it's not a great place for either a leader to be. I think it is especially vulnerable for Kevin Falcon, who has had a head start, who is a long-time power player in British Columbia politics, former Minister of Finance, former Minister of Transportation, Health. I think he basically had all the big portfolios at one point. But the problem is, his party is shrinking in terms of its relevance. The rebrand was also supposed to be about centering right-of-center politics in British Columbia at a time when the NDP very cleverly, under John Horgan, pivoted right into the center and became a party that people didn't need to be, you know, hardcore labor unionists to get behind, which was very much the NDP of Dave Barrett and the NDP of Glenn Clark. He rebranded, made the party more centrist. That left less room for Kevin Falcon and what is now BC United to operate within, while a right flank, and particularly an increasingly disaffected northern interior part of the province, feels its priorities are not being listened to and dealt with, and then you've also just got that federal conservative phenomenon which seems unstoppable. What do you deal with in all of that? Well, let's also not lose sight, as James mentioned, of David Eby and the BC NDP's potential vulnerability. If you were to see some sort of détente or merger or cooperation or whatever it is you want to call it between these two right-of-centre entities, all of a sudden you've got the BC NDP in pretty vulnerable situation, because we look at this quarter by quarter, every 3 months. People may be still coalescing around the British Columbia New Democrats, but it doesn't mean that they're particularly satisfied with their management on housing, on cost of living, on the opioid crisis, on health care, on any number of really critical issues. This isn't about loving what they're doing. It's just liking it maybe a little bit more than the two other options that they see in front of them.
So James, how do you see this playing out for the two right-of-center parties here? I mean, you know, either this could be something that splits the vote between the Conservatives and BC United and helps David Eby, or does this sort of focus the mind of the change voter and say, I got to pick one of these, and it coalesces it? Where does it go?
It has always been a fact that in British Columbia, the NDP provincially will always get between 35 and 45% of the vote. That's about their floor, that's about their ceiling, and it's pretty much been unchanged for my entire lifetime. So the combination of the two parties has to come together and consist of a larger plurality than that. The report that you had going into this segment said that they have 5 months to get it together. You really don't, right? The election is in 5 months. You would actually have to do this probably in the next month at most. And you would have to have the two entities come together and effectively have a proper corporate combination and a merger. And one of the parties would have to disappear, and the other they would have to be subsumed into the other. You'd have to have a leadership race and some kind of consent and buy-in from the party membership to dissolve one of the two brands. The obvious path, to me, would be for BC United to be absolved into the Conservative Party of British Columbia, have a fresh leadership race, and to tools down into Unite. And if you did that, you broadened the tent and had a policy manifesto and a document that was brought together, a merger of the caucuses, you could have one singular alternative free enterprise coalition alternative to the NDP going into the fall campaign. That's probably the easiest path, because the Conservative brand is on a high nationally. It's untainted in provincial politics for the past 50 years. BC United brand hasn't taken off, but there are some phenomenally talented MLAs, former cabinet ministers, and people in that party. And look, John Rustad and Kevin Falcon, you know, they've been colleagues in the legislature now for over a decade. They were cabinet colleagues side by side, fighting for issues of importance to British Columbia on a broad cross-section of issues. They are friendly and friends, and they can get along and should get along for the best interests of the party. If they don't, both of these parties, both of these leaders, and all of these personalities will be disposed of, and British Columbians will look for something new in the very near future. So it's their choice. Come together and do something collaborative and creative, or say goodbye to your political careers in about 6 months' time.
Okay, it could be the BC United Liberal Conservative Party, just to sort of bring all the factions together after the year they've had.